Chapter 3, Section 1, North Africa and Southwest Asia. So now we're going to be focusing on the areas of North Africa and Southwest Asia. That's area that has countries like Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, that area of the world. So long ago, the first people to make a civilization, signed civilization, they started approximately 5,000 years ago. So what does that mean exactly? Well, a civilization has a government, it has order, it has laws, people pay attention to special jobs and skills. That's what it means to be a civilization. One of the first areas was named Mesopotamia. Where was that? Well, there's a river called Tigris. And then a little ways away, there's another river called Euphrates. The area that's between them is the area that's called Mesopotamia. So what happened? Well, that was where the first civilization started. There, the people would start working as farmers. Well, why? That soil was especially good for growing crops. Now, that area is called Iraq, and it's also Syria. So around the year 4500 BC, people started changing where they got their food. Prior to this, they were hunters and gatherers. But for 500 years, they learned how to farm and grow food. And they could do that how? Well, that area, they noticed that it was really good soil. So they learned that if they grow their food, they could keep it for another day. But how did they farm? Well, first they had to dig trenches. And that's how the water would get to the crops. It's called an irrigation system. The water would spread to the crops, and that way they didn't have to be near the water in order to get the water to their crop. So, going forward, people started settling down. They weren't moving around or roaming anymore. They started having villages and cities. And so what happened was a lot of those cities came together to form something called a city-state. That meant that there was one area that had one ruler. That ruler normally was also their religious leader. So a king or a priest would rule, and that is a type of government called theocracy. So the first city-state was named Sumer. That's where they formed a very first kind of writing called cuneiform. It uses a triangle shape to imprint different shapes and collections of shapes in order to make a form of writing. Around 2300 BCE, one city-state was called Akkad. They were infamous for being a warring people. They would get involved in battles and take over all the areas that they conquered to form an empire. So it was a larger area with one ruler, but they weren't the only ones. There was another one called Babylon that came against Akkad, and they won. So Akkad ended up dissolving, but Babylon kept on going strong. One of the rulers in Babylon was named Hammurabi. He made a list of rules that people had to obey. It was called Hammurabi's Code. Suppose the law, you decided you didn't want to do it. You were going to break the law. You didn't agree. That was fine, but you would be punished. You might have to pay some money, or go to jail, or you could be put to death. Sometimes people would go to war, but other times they would trade or barter with their neighbors. One famous group for trading is a group called the Phoenicians. That area is currently known as Lebanon. They were famous for trading. And then there's also, remember, a very infamous river in Egypt called the Nile. It's the longest river at 4,160 miles long. At the one end, the water spreads out and forms something called a delta. So the Nile is in Egypt. And their king is called a pharaoh. He's the one that rules the country. Did Egypt believe in only one god? No. Egypt was what's called polytheistic. That meant they believed in many gods. So suppose you were an Egyptian and you died and you had money. People would take care of your body by using a chemical process called embalming, and then they would wrap bandages all over your body, and you would lay there in your coffin. Why? Well, the Egyptian people believed that when you died, you would move on to the afterlife. Suppose you were really rich. After they had taken care of your body, would you be put in the ground? No. You would be put in something called a pyramid. It's a very fancy tomb for rich people. So there is where you would spend time with the gods in your afterlife. Right now, today, people who go to Egypt can still see the pyramids. They're still there. And scholars will study to learn about ancient Egypt. So how do they learn about Egypt? Well, long ago, there was a form of writing called hieroglyphics. It used pictures instead of words. So if somebody put a bunch of pictures in a row, that would be like you typing on a computer. So sometimes the pictures were on stones or on the wall, but also they had a thing of paper called papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that they would pound down and make into paper. And then that they could use for writing their hieroglyphs also. The person who was responsible for the writing is called a scribe. He is the one that would do the writing. One famous scribe that did some writing on a rock that's called the Rosetta Stone. That stone had 3 different kinds of writing for the same thing so that multiple people could read it. So long ago, Egypt and Babylon would go to war, and they would take over the cultures and the areas that they dominated. But sometimes Egypt got beat as well, so some of their territories got lost.